Everyone. I'm just going to allow for some attendees to get into the room. So it is 1 o'clock, but bear with us because we have some people just joining. I can see the participant number moving up. Okay, so I think a good number of people have now been able to join. Welcome to this very timely and much needed session, carefully positioned between a very rapidly deteriorating situation in India and India's 4 yearly universal periodic review by within the UN human rights system. My name is Claire Thomas, and we have a very eminent and distinguished panel of speakers here today to take you through some of the more recent developments in India vis-a-vis its human rights commitments. So they're all going to have a chance to speak and cover different aspects. Meenakshi Ganguly, who's the South Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, will talk about religious minorities in India. Akar Patel, Chair of Amnesty India, will talk about the human rights situation in Jammu and Kashmir. Diane Ungoda from the Protection Order from Frontline Defenders will talk us through human rights defenders and civil space. And then I'm delighted that we have Stephen Rapp, a former US Ambassador at Large. He's been doing a lot of investigation and assessment work recently, who will talk us through some of the international law perspectives. And then to finalize and summarize and bring it all home, the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, Fernand de Warens. There will be an opportunity for audience members to pose a question to any of the panel members or all the panel members. To do that, you need to use the Q&A function. The chat function is disabled, I'm afraid, so you need to use the Q&A function. Your questions will not be visible to the audience. And as a normal precaution, we will not be identifying the questioners by their affiliation or name, unless you particularly want us to, in which case specify in the question. And the final thing from me, which is slightly ironic really, is to share with you that I am not necessarily a preeminent expert on the situation in India, and I'm sure that many different people could have been brought forward to moderate this panel. MRG approached a number of people, and we encountered a certain reluctance of people involved in India, working in, living in, resident in India, Indian nationals, to moderate a panel of this type. So I think that in a way is kind of testament or an introduction to the kind of context that we are living with in terms of India at the moment. So bear with me, but we will do our best to make sure that all the questions and answers the questions are fully answered, and you get to hear from all of the panelists, despite that slightly tricky context we're all operating in. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Meenakshi, as I've mentioned, from Human Rights Watch, who's going to talk us through an overview of the situation of religious minorities in India. Over to you, Meenakshi.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Minority Rights, for organizing this, and welcome to my panelists as well. I look forward to hearing from you. We are witnessing multiple challenges to the human rights situation right now, whether it's protection of minorities, whether it is promoting rule of law, and one of the biggest challenges, of course, at this point, are the social and economic challenges that is confronting the world. The cost of living crisis that is impacting many people, millions across the world, linked to the pandemic, linked to the war, and also a difficult situation in the economy. Now, in a situation like this, what is most needed is a robust civil society. But we are finding that the Indian government has become increasingly prickly about criticism. It's the media, the NGOs, the humanitarians, private sector. I mean, you just heard what Claire said about even someone moderating this talk. There is so much pressure right now, which is actually undermining what should be a united effort to handle the many challenges. In fact, anyone that the dissent, and a time in this sort of need for free and frank conversation, dissent is just being shouted down. That said, there are, and you'll be hearing from Diane about this, there are a number of activists that continue to work, to continue to take chances, to bravely speak up, and to help the millions that are in desperate need of all kinds of assistance. We have, we are right now talking about the situation of religious minorities in India. And this is a particularly difficult situation and a difficult conversation, because this is so linked to the politics of the country right now. So the ruling BJP and its affiliate organizations have always promoted a majoritarian Hindu ideology. In political terms, that is, when there is an electoral democracy, obviously appealing to the majoritarian sentiment tends to win votes. So in itself, a political agenda would not have been what we would have been worried about, but what we're worried about is the outcome. And the outcome is that this kind of agenda, this kind of sort of politics has entrenched bigotry in society. It is building on previous mistrust. It is building on something that that Indian leaders had worked, and the Indian Constitution had worked very hard to address post 1947 and post the sort of, the violence that had played out in 46 and 47 and prior, the kind of religious rift that had come up. There were decades of work, public campaigns, education systems, sharing of festivals to build a society that somehow managed to work together and could together work towards a sort of a national dream of progress and future. India is 80% Hindu. That means 20% are, roughly 20% are minorities, but it's a large population. So that's hundreds of millions of people who are religious minorities in India. So these are not small numbers. Just in terms of a Muslim population, there are more Muslims in India than most other Muslim countries in the world. So these are not simple, these are large numbers of people, and this kind of bigotry therefore impacts society in a very, very grievous way, in a very harmful way. So we are seeing that impact in as an Indian myself. I see this at dinner table conversations with our own relatives. We see it in WhatsApp forwards. We see it in the way that it's a sort of trickle of poison that is now digging into society as a whole. And the outcome is often been a range of things. So on one hand, we have the hate-filled speeches by political leaders that is inciting vigilante violence. It is leading to mob attacks, whether it's on mosques, on eateries, on vendors, just people, the economic work that particularly Muslims are able to conduct, but also Christians. We've seen churches being attacked. And we're also seeing it in the discriminatory policies that the government is adopting, which is embedding some of this sort of bigotry into policy. And therefore, some of the worst things that could possibly happen have also been sort of posed in images. We've seen convicted gang rapists being feted by community members. We have seen murder accused posing for pictures with legislators. So the patronage to this is also becoming particularly challenging and hard. But more than that, on the one hand, there's the sort of social impact of it, but then there is what has often been recognized in India is a self-correcting society, one that is a democracy, therefore an attractive business proposition, one where investors are welcomed, almost as a counter to China, a democracy that functions. And in there is where the problem lies, because it is actually the same ideology is now infiltrating into institutions. So I want to speak briefly to that. For instance, we talk about the media, and yes, there's a chunk of media in India that is under enormous pressure to self-censor or are not even getting the kind of advertising they need to do their work. But there's also a very powerful set of media, a very loud pro-government broadcast media in particular, that promotes hate. And we have not seen the kind of accountability that is needed. For instance, during the pandemic, there was this whole talk of Corona jihad to try and blame the pandemic on Muslims. These were blatantly false claims. They impacted the government's response to handle the pandemic. And yet we have not seen this media even retract or apologize for these false claims. And this is just one example. Repeatedly, we find these false claims being made that are impacting sort of governance issues. Institutions like the National Human Rights Commission, constitutional bodies like the Commission for Children, Commission for Women, have all been infiltrated to a large part by political appointees, and they have been either silent or partisan in their interventions. The police, 2 years ago, we saw policemen making some grievously injured Muslim men sing the national anthem. One of them died. From there, one would have imagined that India would respond immediately to ensure that the police acted in an unbiased manner. Yet recently, just last month, we have seen police holding some men accused of something or the other, being publicly flogged while a crowd cheers on. It suggests a breakdown in the worst form of rule of law, where the police believe that they can also punish, and they have the right to do so without reprimand or any kind of accountability. The bureaucracy has also been co-opted to a large part, and we see this with civic authorities increasingly using summary and abusive punishments, like demolishing of Muslim homes or demolishing of homes of other suspects, but mostly Muslims, without any legal authorization. We've seen federal agencies like the CBI or the Enforcement Directorate acting in a partisan manner, in a politically motivated manner, in targeting people that are critics of the government. And lastly, the judiciary. Now, in most cases, eventually, the judiciary has delivered, but it takes years. And in that time, activists, people that protest, people that the government does not like, people that are critics of the ruling BJP can be accused of in a range of extremely draconian laws, and they can spend years in prison, as is happening. And you'll probably hear from Diane about many of our colleagues who are in prison even as we speak right now. Now, officials that are disregarding the rule of law, particularly when it comes to the targeting of Muslims, or somehow enabling an environment where it is fine to target religious minorities, particularly Muslims, because it fits the ruling ideology, will only enable further discrimination and further violence. But that is a slippery slope, because once the rule of law crumbles, it leads to a collapse in the justice system, and that impacts the entire society. And therefore, India needs to reverse course. And hopefully this UPR process will be the start of that, where India begins to hear from its peers about the expectations that come from a country like India, one of the largest economies of the world, where people are looking for leadership on human rights instead of the sort of very disturbing actions that are occurring domestically. And we hope that if that doesn't happen, our concern is that all that will happen is that the state will become more and more aggressive. It'll almost become self-fulfilling. All the people that are being accused now of breaking the law will start breaking the law, because the rule of law will break down. People will start imagining that they can get away with anything because they don't need to go through the justice process. And that will be a really sad outcome for the hopes of India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meenakshi. That's been an amazing introduction to the nationwide context, particularly for religious minorities, which we're hearing is on a downward trend, which must concern us all. But I'm going to turn now to Akbar Patel, who is chair of Amnesty India, and he's going to take us into a deeper dive into a very special and particular part of India, and talk about the human rights situation in Jammu and Kashmir in particular. Akbar.
Thank you. I'll try and take a fewer than the 7 minutes I have. I'll begin by saying that Kashmir is the only part of the subcontinent to not be under democratic rule and has not been for more than 2 years now. It has seen episodes of non-democratic rule several times over the last 3 decades. None as bad, I would say, I would suggest as the current period. I have a colleague who has a PowerPoint presentation. I would request her to turn it on if she can. I'll start nonetheless. That Kashmiri children were the only part of the world to spend the pandemic without access to schooling. There was no telemedicine in Kashmir either. For 17 months. The government denied access to the internet to Kashmir. 60% of all internet shutdowns in the world happen in India, according to Access Now, and this has been the case for the last several years, mostly because of what goes on in Kashmir. Kashmir has a different media policy than the rest of India. Journalists are not only censored, but told what to write and what not to write. Government advertising, which is a large source of revenue for much of India's media, is withheld if you don't follow these rules. Human rights defenders and journalists are frequently picked up by the police without cause, without a case. They are shaken down repeatedly. Often we've had colleagues from our own organizations who've been summoned repeatedly and told and asked why it is that they're doing the kind of work that they're doing and to stop. The Kashmir Press Club, which was functional all these decades, was shut down a few months ago. Shows no sign of reopening. The state uses the various parts of the police, of the finance ministry, of the home ministry, and the departments therein to be able to enforce strict compliance with what it sees as anything that deviates from what the state wants to be seen and what the messaging in Kashmir ought to be. India is a common law nation, but habeas does not seem to apply to Kashmiris. Even the Supreme Court of India did not decide on the habeas corpus petitions of Kashmiris, including former chief ministers, who continue to be held under house arrest. The government claims that they are not actually being held, while media, including the BBC, has shown that this is not the case, that they don't have any freedom to travel. Whenever it is that the government wants to, it can restrict the movement of people, including, as I said, former chief ministers. Revolving door arrests under laws for preventive detention, where no crime is committed, but people are jailed nonetheless, continue to be used. Laws that have detention in jail of up to 2 years. In some laws, 6 months. People are kept in jail, let out, and then put back in jail under a different charge. The judiciary is mostly compliant with this. It is the one part of the state that can actually check the excesses of the executive, but it seems to choose not to do so. We have anti-terror laws, which are used fairly indiscriminatorily by the state, particularly in Kashmir. Not that that specific law is needed. There are many other laws under which the state can jail people without crime or charge. There have been travel bans on Kashmiris, including journalists who are stopped at the airport, told they can't leave, not told the reason why. This has been fairly regular, and though the courts have tried to step in here, they aren't successful in getting the government to do the right thing, which is not do this at all. People continue to be stopped at the airport and sent back home because they are thought to that they shouldn't be participating in meetings like this and talking about what is going on back home. The highest number of police-involved deaths in India come in Kashmir, which I should remind you is one of India's smaller states. It doesn't have the size of population that many of the others do. Access to justice has been very poor for those people, not just for habeas, but for crimes committed by security forces and the police. It is almost impossible for the ordinary Kashmiri to be able to get justice. Oftentimes, the crimes against them are celebrated in the media, including by the armed forces, and people who resist this are seen as, in some way, traitors. Things continue to be in decline. I will end by saying that India remains a constitutional, secular a democracy, at least on paper. It remains vulnerable to external pressure, particularly from democratic states and the multilateral bodies that we have chosen to be a part of. And it's important that our friends abroad tell India that what it is doing, generally speaking, in the human rights frame, but especially in Kashmir, is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arakar, for taking us through that very specific situation in a part of India, which very often, in some ways, is the sinkhole of freedom and democracy and human rights. I'm going to turn now to Dian Ungoda, who's the protection coordinator from Frontline Defenders, and she's going to talk about this issue that both speakers have already mentioned around the freedom of civil society to organize and operate and try to challenge the state on occasion where human rights norms and standards are not being followed. So Dian, maybe I can now turn to you.
Thank you. I think I'm going to keep this even shorter because a lot of it has been discussed before. So complementing what Akar and Meenakshi said, the crisis for human rights defenders reflects a broader crisis that Meenakshi alluded to. And it is a crisis of impunity, and India has been getting away with this without any kind of benchmarks. There's no calling out. They sit very much side by side with their international peers with very little accountability for what happens in country. In a context of impunity, as we've seen across South Asia, it is human rights defenders, particularly those from religious and ethnic minorities or from groups that are traditionally persecuted, that bear the brunt, because they speak out on these violations, and the cost of speaking out is not just enforced silence, but it is also punishment. When silence is the objective, then reprisals aimed at silencing might work, but when punishment and cruelty is the objective, it goes beyond silence, it goes beyond crushing, and it becomes intended at punishing not just the defenders, but their families and the wider community, including the communities that they represent. Akar has spoken at length about Kashmir, and one of the, I'm just going to add a little bit more to that before moving to the wider the context also in other parts of India, where in Kashmir there is a silence and there is a fear of even of communicating. Now we know that journalists have been stopped at the airport. We know that they are on unofficial no-fly lists, where there is no legal basis for this. The speaker before me alluded to that. When you ask them, do you want to take this up? No, you cannot take it up, because if you do, then you risk preventive detention, or you risk of being punished further and recurrence of violence. The recurrence of violence is what people tend to fear the most. Many of them are living with multiple FIRs, which are used against them at opportune moments. For instance, in Khurram's case, there are multiple FIRs which are now being brought back. People are being questioned about 2020 FIRs. This nature of the way they are being targeted and this episodic cycle of making sure that there are always cases against you at all times is deliberate. It is meant to make sure that you feel the full weight of the state, but also the full weight of your identity. And your identity is going to carry that burden of the work that you do. They increase the cost of doing this work for defenders, particularly human rights defenders from minority and religious and ethnic minorities, or defenders from persecuted backgrounds. And the fear of speaking about this means that there is a silence even around what is happening. If we do not have clear party lines on how much we can say about who's being targeted, about raising specific names. What we can say is that while Khurram's case is well known, and we know, and many organizations are following it, it is not only Khurram who is being targeted. There is an ecosystem around him who are cooperating, younger activists who are cooperating, very willing to cooperate with any investigation, but this targeting has to stop. And that can happen only with concerted effort and diplomatic pressure. Outside of Kashmir, we have seen that in UP linked to the CAA, some of the largest number of arrests that happened in UP, the custodial violence and the torture that we have documented against human rights defenders, that we are not able to come out and speak about openly, although it is well known. Under the arrest that happened for the Citizenship Amendment Act, of the 12 people in jail, there are at least six who are known human rights defenders. All of them are Muslim. of the Bhima Koregaon case, the 16 defenders who have been arrested so far, 13 of whom remain in jail. If you take Stan Swamy, who tragically died in detention due to lack of health care and medical intervention, these are defenders who are either from minority communities, from Dalit indigenous communities, or who represent Dalit and indigenous rights. Hidni Markham, who was arrested from a Women's Day protest in Chhattisgarh, is still to be released. She's being held, she's an indigenous woman leader, and she continues to be held under multiple FIRs. These are people who engage with the state on arbitrary detention. They are now becoming the victims that they advocated for, and that is the cost they pay. Stan Swamy was advocating against arbitrary detention, and he had the petitions and the claims before court on all of this, but he's being punished not for Bhima Koregaon. He's being punished for this work. Hidni Markham is not being punished because she stood against, she's a terrorist, or she tried to oppose a police station in a community village. No, she's being punished because she was systematically engaging the state on the arbitrary detentions of indigenous and Adivasis that was happening in her state. And now she is a victim of that, and she's forgotten. Her name is not known. And this is disproportionate to, and this is despite the complete crisis facing all human rights defenders in India, the burden and the invisibility of defenders. We watched Siddique Kappan being chained to a bed, his medical condition, and we were silent, largely silent. We don't see the uproar and the furor and the kind of work that is happening here. These meetings are very important at spotlighting this issue of what does it mean to be a minority and to be a human rights defender, and what does it mean to be a woman and a minority and a human rights defender in a country where nobody, as you rightly said, Claire, is even willing to moderate or speak out because India is too powerful. And what does it mean for the international community to stand side by side at international spaces and do photo opportunities directly or the equivalent of with your oppressor while you languish in jail? And I think we need to do more, and we need to do more publicly. As we message privately, I think the world needs to do more publicly to call India out. And on the judicial cases and the legal persecution, one point is that India is very good at saying this is our judicial system at work. But it is the executive and the politics behind the executive that decides to arrest, that decides to investigate. This is executive overreach, which takes place without judicial checks and balances. The judiciary is the last bastion. It's a final play in this theater. It is the executive and the prosecution that needs to be held accountable, and the lack of judicial oversight. If we miss this, we're missing the food for the trees, and we're allowing governments, not only India, but others also in our region, to get away with this kind of crime against human rights defenders. And of course, as always, it is the minorities that are worst affected, and the opportunity cost is on them, not on the state. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Diane. And it was great to hear those specific details of specific cases, to add that to the more general national picture that we heard from our first two speakers. It's really focused our mind very effectively, I think. I'm going to turn now to Stephen Rapp, who's a former US ambassador at large, as well as someone who's been extremely eminent in international justice circles, many international tribunals and courts. And he's going to tell us a little bit about his perspective on the international law and how that maps onto the situation we've been hearing about from our first three speakers. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Claire, and it's a great honor to be in this forum with such distinguished speakers. As Claire indicated, my work has been in international justice, particularly in international criminal justice, prosecuting in the Rwanda Tribunal, and then also the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and then serving for 6 years in the Obama administration as the ambassador at large for global criminal justice. But in my work since I've left the State Department in 2015, it's focused more broadly on human rights and violations of human rights that are often the harbingers, or the violations that actually lay the groundwork for atrocities later. Because quite often when you have violations of free speech and free assembly, when human rights defenders are jailed, when people who are demanding their rights are called terrorists. These are actually and then prosecuted and locked up for long periods of time without review of their bail or with trial. These are often the harbingers of worse crimes that happen later on, and that is very much what we've seen tragically beginning in the Indian context. I'm specifically in this forum because I joined a group of two other international experts, Marzuki Darusman, former Attorney General of Indonesia, later head of inquiry panels on Sri Lanka and also on Myanmar, and Sonia Bezerko, a human rights defender in Serbia, who co-authored together with a lot of academic and other support this is the summary of it, but a 494-page report, which was issued in June, about 3 months ago, and is available on the website of the University of the Free State in South Africa. That report follows a standard of basically looking at credible evidence, first of human rights violations, and then also of potential international crimes committed in India against the Muslim population since 2019. In doing so, one recognizes that we weren't making judicial findings. These were basically a statement that there was credible evidence to support our findings, but that what was necessary thereafter was a process by which there would be formal investigation. Ideally, always at the national system, at the national level, by the judiciary, by human rights institutions locally, and then consensually working with special rapporteurs and others as part of international human rights compliance, and then and only then situations which are less consensual, the establishment of a commission of inquiry, such as we've had in other situations like that in Myanmar or Sri Lanka, and then and potentially then also resort in the case of international crimes to prosecutions in third countries, as we've seen happening increasingly out of crimes in Syria and elsewhere. And so before we go there, however, we want to try to deal with this at the national level. I would note, in particular, we had an introduction to our report by my good friend who presided over one of the trials and then presided as president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Navi Pillay, who wrote about her concern that we had this sort of pattern of deprivation, of undermining the equal rights of Muslims in India by the government and by the leading political party. And that's evident in these acts like the Citizenship Amendment Act, in which all other religions are treated in one way and Muslims not at all, in the National Registers of Citizens, which has had such an impact on Muslim women in particular in Assam, and then also in terms of the revocation of special autonomous status in Jammu and Kashmir, the only area of the country with a Muslim population. And as she says, as I've indicated earlier, this normalized unequal treatment, it furthered exclusion, stigmatization, and led to violence against this group. Now, in our report, we deal with a whole variety of what are violations of human rights law, where the obligation is on the state to protect these human rights, and we're dealing specifically with specific areas of the country, with Delhi, with Uttar Pradesh, with Assam, and then with Jammu and Kashmir, and specifically, detailed violations of human rights, arbitrary deprivation of the right to life, arbitrary detention, discriminatory treatment, gender-based violence, continuing on up to more serious violations as well, that actually get us into the area of potential violations of international criminal law. And I want to deal with those briefly because that's the area in which I've had the most expertise and in which I prosecuted those responsible for the hate media in Rwanda, for instance, a case that we tried and that I was the chief prosecutor of. early in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where Nabi Pillay was the president. Later tried the chief of state of Liberia, Charles Taylor, was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and today is doing a 50-year sentence based upon 11 counts of conviction. But dealing with what we have in terms of international crimes, but specifically when we look at the violence against the Muslim protesters, the sexual violence, and the treatment of the killings, encounter killings, but also killings of demonstrators, the sexual violence that occurred, the torture of people once they were detained, reached the level of either systematic or widespread level, such that it would satisfy the predicate of crimes against humanity, at least in the context of Uttar Pradesh and what occurred there. So there are prosecutable cases under international law. And understand, when you talk about international criminal law, these are never cases exclusively of national concern or internal affairs. When crimes are committed under international law, crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against humanity, they're the concern of all of humankind, and they can frankly be prosecuted anywhere where one can get a hold of any of the individuals that are responsible for these crimes. Then we also have potential war crimes being committed in Jammu and Kashmir, because we have a non-international armed conflict, and the deprivations of life there, and the torture and the prolonged detention constitutes a war crime. And then finally, of greatest concern are the kind of hate speech messages that have been delivered by religious leaders that are frankly even more explicit than some of those that I prosecuted in the Rwandan context. Ones where religious leaders speak of the need to organize a campaign, a cleansing campaign to eliminate the problem and emerge victorious. Specifically, one who describes needing to have 100 men who would each kill 2 million, and then we would emerge victorious. In other words, the whole population of Muslim population of India would be eliminated. I mean, you don't have that kind of explicit language in other contexts. Now, of course, we're not reaching the point yet of alleging genocide, but incitement to genocide does not require that the genocide actually takes place, but that you have a volatile situation, you have speakers that intend that occur, that their message is taken by their audience as a call for violence, and that certainly evidence of that violence are the kind of lynch mob killings that have occurred. And these are crimes under international law. Now, of course, there are also crimes under Indian law and under Indian hate speech law, which is frankly much broader than international law. But if you look at what happened after the suppression of the CAA demonstrations, it wasn't those that were inciting the violence or committing the violence that were prosecuted. It was the victims who were prosecuted. And at least in one situation, a judge ordered the police to look at a video and to see actually how the violence was committed against these individuals. That particular judge was removed from the case the following day because of a political decision. So we see India with its great democratic tradition, with its secular constitution, undermining that through the actions of its government and putting people greatly at risk, and certainly many already injured, killed, detained, tortured, and in some cases sexually violated. These are things that the international community is right to be concerned about. We hope that they're confronted in the course of this UPR process in Geneva next month, and that if we don't see positive action at the national level, that we need to proceed as we have at the Human Rights Council and about 20 other situations in the last decade to a formal commission of inquiry, and then to dealing with charging individuals in third states for violations of international law. But obviously much better that India confront this problem and use its own law, its own institutions to prevent worse crimes from happening in the future, with state elections at the end of this year, with a federal election in 24. The dangers, again, of this kind of violence are very real. And we can't say that people haven't been warned because it's happened before, and the risk is very great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That's been really excellent. I'm pleased to be able to say to everyone that we do have some very interesting questions coming in, and we'll turn to them after our last speaker, so that the panel have a chance to prepare. I think I'm going to start with a question from what I suspect is a diplomat in the audience who's asking, and I'm going to boil it down for you. If you could recommend one question to India during the UPR process, you get one question or issue or recommendation each, as specific as possible, what would it be? While you have a think about that, we're going to turn to our last input speaker, which is the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, Fernanda Lorenz, who I think is also going to talk a bit about what could be done moving forward, maybe picking up some of our last speakers' points, or maybe something completely different.
Thank you very much, Claire. I hope that you will be able to hear me well. I'm speaking from Gambia. This is an extremely timely event because the topic is one which has been addressed, as we've heard, by a number of organizations, and many of them have increasingly sounded alarm bells, including a recently formed coalition for minority rights in India that just released a detailed, and I would say even frightening report, which concluded, and allow me to quote on this right now, that minorities in India are on the edge of a precipice as their rights and freedoms have eroded in the face of a growing violent majoritarian ideology, end quote. Now, myself and other special rapporteurs, we've also expressed in recent years grave concerns at what can be described as a deteriorating human rights environment, ranging from the ending of regional autonomy for Kashmir, when we've heard that since the central union government took over 2 years ago, Kashmir is no longer under democratic control, to the seeming targeting of human rights defenders and their organizations, particularly, I would say, and that this needed to be highlighted, particularly those trying to protect minorities. Let's be frank, we are seeing a pattern here, a pattern of deliberate targeting of specific minorities as a group, as being somehow alien to India or threatening others, and who somehow, because of they're different, they are often portrayed as somehow not really belonging or not deserving as are members of the Hindu majority. Now, let me emphasize this point. These are not individual incidents. Many have pointed out that there is a wider context, a state-led or encouraged systematic targeting of religious minorities, in particular Muslims, but others also, such as Christians. Now, obviously, there are complexities, there's nuances to every situation, but it's clear, for example, that hate speech and incitement to violence in social media has been increasing significantly and in brutality in recent years. We've heard issues of incitement to genocide. And let's be very clear about this also. Most of the targets are mainly minorities such as Muslims, Christians, and others. We're seeing a process which I called a poisoning of the mind and poisoning of society in a number of my reports. Minority Muslim women, for example, have experienced denigration, threats, and harassment in social media, including social media apps, as some of you will have heard, such as Suli Deals and Muli Bai, which are where Muslim women were listed for auction with photographs sourced without permission and obviously doctored. So to be blunt, none of this is accidental. You have specific minorities and women minorities targeted using a word such as Suli, which is a derogatory Islamophobic slur. There is increasingly extreme violence, even lynch mobs, a surging hate speech that stigmatizes religious or belief minorities and other minorities such as Dalits, including, unfortunately, by senior political figures. And we're seeing increasing hostility and violence against religious minorities, particularly Muslims right now. So Muslims and other minorities are massively, disproportionately the targets of hate speech, and bigotry has, in a sense, become normalized and even politically instrumentalized. We just heard that. I've raised this in a number of reports and communications to the government of India, including in my 2021 report to the UN Human Rights Council. I've also recently called for the protection of Dalit and minority women and girls, Dalit and Muslim minority women and girls from rape and sexual violence, and that the government needed to address these atrocities by tackling the underlying bigotry, prejudice, hate, and dehumanizing of these minorities, which create an environment where particularly women and girls become vulnerable and targets of these attacks. Someone else has mentioned it. There's also the phenomenon of growing impunity, as those committing crimes against minorities are not always prosecuted or punished. And here again, there seems to be a trend, which I expressly expressed concerns about, where the victims themselves are targeted and prosecuted when they should be protected. There was even a case, which I think one of the earlier speakers referred to, where recently men who had been accused and imprisoned for gang raping a Muslim woman were released, and not only released, it seems their release was even feted by a number of certain segments of Indian society. The picture many have painted in India is of growing intolerance and exclusion. And this includes many systematic aspects which we have to acknowledge. This includes anti-conversion laws, such as in Karnataka, which makes it an offense to entice a conversion with the promise of marriage or other temptation such as for a better lifestyle. And this is legislation. This is not against the rule of law, but where the rule of law itself is distorted, because the legislation allows, in very vague language, it allows civil servants to intervene and to annul a marriage and any conversion contrary to what is considered under the Indian legislation as contrary to freedom of religion nationally, although not internationally. Observers have pointed out that it intimidates mainly minorities. And let's be honest, it intimidates mainly those of the Muslim and Christian faith in India and some of its states. You have the exclusion of specific religious or other minorities that is taking root even in the most basic of rights, such as citizenship. In 2019, the National Citizenship Register was published for Assam. And as my and other mandates have indicated in a communication to the Indian government, we were and remain deeply concerned that close to 2 million people were left out of the list release, and who would now have to go through a process to prove their citizenship. Once again, let's be clear, many of these end up stateless, and it seems that most are members of Muslim, Bengali, and other minorities. The number of legislation changes and other aspects, practice and policies that discriminate, exclude Muslim and other minorities is mind-boggling in recent years. There is much more that could be said. Many others have mentioned it, including the criminalizing of activities that affect mainly minorities, such as cow slaughter laws and so forth, and particularly the targeting of minorities and minority defender, human rights defender organizations. From what we've heard, to conclude, the scale of denial of human rights, even through legislation and its application by the judiciary, its systemic and national scope, the refusal of authorities to engage fully with global human rights mechanisms, including special procedures, and in some cases, the rising brutality and incitement of hatred and violence against minorities are of such gravity and magnitude, as I said earlier, that we have situations of possible international crimes, including incitement to genocide. It's time for the international community to actually step up to the task if we are really serious about reversing a trend of a systematic pattern where minorities are marginalized and demonized. They're less than second-class citizens because of their religion. The UPR process is important, but perhaps it's too slow or insufficient to tackle what is an extremely troubling and widespread violation of the human rights of Muslims and other minorities. It's perhaps perhaps nothing short of an international investigative mechanism. It has been done by the UN Security Council or the Human Rights Council with countries such as Syria, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, and more recently, Ukraine, or some other investigation process as the one that was prepared by the UN Human Rights High Commissioner in relation to Xinjiang in China. Something like this may now be necessary to consider because nothing else seems to be working. So I hope this panel will consider this and other ways to move forward, to reverse a trend, which unchanged will bring us back to a very dark period of our history, where some minorities were not considered to be equal human beings in dignity, respect, and rights. Merci, thank you, shukran, dam yavad.
Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur. So as promised, I just want to give everyone on the panel 30 seconds. We will go in the same order that people spoke in, literally 30 seconds to say that if you were picking, I mean, the UPR process we've been explained may not be enough to turn India's course around. It is an opportunity and it is imminent, and we do have some diplomats in the audience. So 30 seconds each, you had to pick one measure that you could get through, get the Indian government to agree to on the back of that UPR review. What would it be? Meenakshi.
Because I spoke mostly to the undermining of independent institutions, I would request diplomats to question India on and make recommendations on once again ensuring that these institutions are credible and independent.
Okay, thank you. And Arakar?
To ask why the UN special rapporteurs are not being allowed to come into India. There are 25 pending visits.
Yeah, that's a good one. Deanne?
To ask about the use of anti-terror laws that are actually meant to combat terror and how they justify using that consistently against human rights defenders across the country.
Okay.
And specifically
Stephen?
on the death of Stan Swamy, because I think that is the strongest pull we currently have.
Okay. Stephen?
Yeah, that would be the impunity question. What's been done to particularly investigate and prosecute those who incited violence against Muslims related to that under human rights laws? What's been done to uphold the victim's right to have violations against them fully investigated and prosecuted?
And Fernand?
What the government of India it will be doing to ensure that human rights defenders, the organization of human rights defenders, can continue their essential work on the ground without fear of retribution and denial of their ability to do so. Thank you.
We have another question on the panel, which is really suggesting that diplomatic missions maybe are relying too heavily on the UPR process, and there's a kind of inconsistency in the messaging that is reaching the Indian government. So one thing might be said during the UPR, but in bilateral conversations, the same human rights stress may not be apparent to the Indian state. I just wonder if anyone on the panel wants to comment on that and make any suggestions about how maybe states can be encouraged to make a more joined up approach in terms of their whole consistent messaging with the Indian state. Does anyone want to volunteer to speak on that?
Well, I agree that the UPR process, there are promises made last time and promises not kept, and it's hard to believe that anything more will come out of this, to be frank, unless there's some prospect of something more serious. And that, I think, means that several states need to form kind of a contact group on India and look for what kind of mechanism is needed to begin to more formally investigate these violations, preliminary to putting forward a report for a request for the High Commissioner to investigate or for a more formal fact-finding or commission of inquiry. Obviously, India's geopolitical importance, its role in the NAM, makes that difficult. But to be frank, if the issue were joined, given the concern of Muslims around the world, given the concern for human rights in many countries, you might not see leadership from countries, for instance, in the Quad, so-called, but I think you'd probably, at the end of the day, have a majority of countries that would vote for something stronger at this stage if the issue were actually presented to the Human Rights Council.
Okay, so maybe a contact group could just serve that function, but it also could serve to remind sympathetic or governments to maintain their positions in between UPRs. We've got a very specific question come in about the national anti-conversion law, which Fernand, you talked a little bit about anti-conversion laws and the possibility that at the national level in India that might become that might be adopted. Does anyone want to comment and reply to that question about whether that's a likelihood? Arulkar.
There are challenges to the existing laws. The BJP has brought in 7 states since 2018, these laws, so-called Love Jihad, and they have been challenged in various courts. So there's no real danger of there being a national law. The problem is that the idea that an adult woman doesn't have any sort of agency and the state doesn't accept her testimony as being valid, that is problematic. And I suspect that in time and not too long from now, these laws will actually be will be struck down.
Okay. Meenakshi?
Yeah, just to add to what Aakash said, it is not really the law, even the wording of the law forbids things like coercion. The point is the practice. And the point is that once it becomes state policy, it allows for non-state actors to intervene. So as Aakash said, it is that not even recognizing the agency of a woman to agree to that she is voluntarily entering a relationship, but the fact that, these non-state actors and supporters of the government can start bullying them and beating up people and so on, which again brings back that rule of law question that I was mentioning.
Okay, we had some other questions and we're rapidly running out of time. Anand very helpfully brought in the issue of Dalits, which one of the audience really wanted to make us clear that Dalits are also affected by many of these factors. And we also had a question about the fact that the previous UPRs have not necessarily shown a huge amount of willingness on the Indian state, or indeed ability to implement commitment to make and then to implement commitments towards an improved human rights situation in the country. But we're kind of rapidly running out of time, I'm afraid. Just to end maybe by obviously saying a huge thank you to all of our panel, to all of the audience who attended, and to really reiterate that call for joined up and serious international action on India in the coming months. MRG periodically does kind of raise a flag about a context that we can see is heading in the wrong direction for minorities, with very, very pressing and real risks of very serious occurrences in the future. And we always tell our diplomatic friends that the earlier you intervene and the more seriously you intervene at an early stage, and the more likely you are to turn things around before positions have been so set in stone that it becomes impossible to get movement. So we're getting very late in that scenario in India, but not so late that we can't try, and the international community should not very, very seriously try to make all of the parties involved, the international governmental organizations, as well as their member states, as well as the Indian government itself, understand the risks of where things may be heading. But I want to say thank you very, very much to all our panelists and all of our audience. And I really very much hope that this has been useful and that conversations will continue in the context of the UPR and indeed any other future mechanism that may be adopted to try to move this situation forward. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a very good day, afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone.